know in the Baha'i faith that it is the primary responsibility to educate women because they have the primary
Right.
responsibility of
Right.
educating the children.
Right.
Obviously, the Baha'i faith is,
Sure.
from some points of view, seen as a heterodox
Right.
aspect of Islam. Does Islam have, are there traditions within Islam that see the same responsibility of the woman to educate the children? Secondly, a lot of the way that Islam is spoken about and criticized in everyday discussions on the news, talking head interviews, is its lack of commitment to education opportunities for women.
Right.
Could you speak about, one, specifically the
Sure.
first question, secondly, your impression of that criticism?
No, and I think that criticism is a fair criticism in certain parts of the world, but that's where America, meaning American Muslims, really can take the lead. Because for American Muslims, I could say this across the board, having looked at, Sunni groups, Shia groups, Ismaili Shia groups, Ahmadiyya groups, there's nothing that prevents American Muslims from sending boys and girls to get higher education. By that I mean not just high school, but university, typically professional, graduate, to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, that kind of thing. And I think that is different from other places, where there's more of a push for the women's role to be more in the house, that kind of thing. In Canada, 40 years ago now, you had a thing called the Canadian Council of Muslim Women that was founded mostly by Muslim women who had Christian and Jewish women friends who had their sort of, Jewish feminist groups or Christian feminist groups. And they were thinking, how come we don't have a Muslim maybe we should have a Muslim women's group. Well, a couple of decades later in Egypt, you have the Egyptians saying, well, wait a minute, the Canadian Muslims have a Canadian Muslim women's group. Maybe we should have an Egyptian Muslim women's group. So you have these really interesting ways in which, we tend to think of North American Islam as only being influenced by Islam from around the world and not the other way.
Absolutely.
That we can do things that can influence countries of origin. So for example, and I'm coming back to your question in a minute, but so for example, I teach at Loyola Marymount University, Jesuit university. We've got a couple hundred Muslim students, about 2/3 of whom are international students, many of whom come from Kuwait, from the Emirates, from the Gulf countries. They come here, they may encounter for the first time a Jewish teacher. They may encounter for the first time our rabbi, because we have a Hillel on campus. They're forced to rethink what they may have been taught about other traditions, about, rights and privileges, that kind of thing. And then they go back to their places, and that's where they transform them. So, in really interesting ways, Americans, one of the things, let me start that again, one of the things that America is leading the world in is education. Anyone's list of the top 10 universities in the world will have at least 5 or 6 American universities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
People send their kids from all over the world to America for universities, including Muslim parents from, Muslim majority countries. Some of those people go back to those countries. So there's that part. I think to your point about feminism and women, there certainly is a value placed on mothers primarily, because who are our first teachers? Our mothers. There's a wonderful hadith, a saying of the Prophet, where a man comes to the Prophet and says, among all people, who is the one, most worthy of my respect? And the Prophet says, your mother. And then the man says, okay, well, after my mother, who is the most worthy of respect? The Prophet says, your mother. And the man says, okay, but after my mother, who is the most worthy of respect? The Prophet says, your mother, and then your father. The idea of the importance of the mother over the father is crucial. And you see across the Muslim world, oftentimes when you have gender segregated societies, that paradoxically creates opportunities for women. If you've got women who are to see women doctors, if you are to have, women judges trying cases that involve women, then you have to develop a system of having women judges, of having women doctors. The medical faculties in most Muslim majority countries tend to have more women tenured than the medical faculties of North American. It's really interesting kinds of things. So on the one hand, we can say that, there are huge problems with the status of women in the Muslim world. And in many cases, there in fact are problems.
Sure, of course
but it's not a universal kind of thing. Then we look at certain other measures to say, okay, so the countries with the most Muslims, numerically, Indonesia is the country with the most Muslims. Then it's probably Pakistan. Then it's probably India. Then it's probably Bangladesh. Those 4 countries make up half of the world's Muslims. All 4 of those countries have had women as leaders. You know, our country hasn't had a woman as a leader. You know, I grew up in Canada. Kim Campbell was prime minister, but she wasn't elected. She became prime minister because the prime minister was sort of, you know, kicked out of office, Brian Mulroney, and she, you know, got brought in, but she didn't win the next election. So Canada or the U.S. have not elected a woman as leader. Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, not, you know, progressive, liberal sort of places have elected women as leaders. So it's really interesting.